Hey guys, before we get into the show, I have a question for you. Are you having trouble sleeping? Are you looking for ways to wind down and relax before bed and get a good night's sleep? Well, the Deep Sleep Sounds podcast sounds like a show for you. It provides white noise, high quality sounds like wind chimes or rainstorms or calming birds to soothe you to sleep, help you relax and unwind right before bedtime. Listen to these soothing sounds designed to help you de-stress and get the rest you've been looking for by checking out the Deep Sleep Sounds podcast on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Hey everyone, this episode of the Ride in NFL DFS podcast is an absolutely spectacular one with Benjamin Robinson of grindingthemocks.com. We get into his aggregated mock draft data and we try to spot inefficiencies in betting lines where we could take advantage and bet some props where his model says there is a big discrepancy in projected draft position and where the betting market says a player is going to go. One thing I do have to note, towards the end of the podcast, something happened with the audio during processing where it sounds like Ben is answering my question before I am finished. So the last 2 or 3 seconds of my question, Ben begins to talk over me. He was not rude in any way and interrupted me during the last part of the podcast. It does sound that way because the audio is not synced perfectly. So hopefully you can overlook that tiny flaw and the first word or two of Ben's sentence and the last word or two of my sentence mesh a little bit, but it shouldn't be too bad, and you should be able to pick up all the ideas and all the all the information that we in NFL DFS podcast. I am joined today by Benjamin Robinson of grindingthemocks.com. I am going to turn the floor over to him to just explain to you a little bit about what he is doing over at grindingthemocks.com. Ben, welcome to the Ride in NFL DFS podcast. We are covering the NFL draft for the last month or so, just trying to nail down the betting angle based on the fact that this is, a DFS, a fantasy, a betting podcast. And I thought having you on would be a great way to shed some light on the mock draft industry. So if you just want to tell the listeners what exactly Grinding the Mocks is, where they can find it, what made you delve into this project.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. First of all, appreciate you giving me the floor. So grinding the mocks is it's kind of a philosophy that I've come up with, and I know I'm not the first person to come up with this because teams have actually been using mock drafts to kind of game theory how the draft might come together for years. I think I'm just probably the first person, at least, to do a lot of public work on it. But grinding the mocks, the idea for this came when me and one of my best friends in college were watching the 2018 NFL draft. We were on his couch at his apartment in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I went to college. And he's a Steelers fan, being from Pittsburgh, and I'm a Bengals fan, being from Cincinnati. And we were watching the draft, and like we always do, we're just kind of enjoying it, having a good time. But we're both like kind of critical thinkers, analytical guys. Maybe your listeners are too. And when we listened to the draft analysts who are, on the television broadcast, and they said, X player, oh man, I think that's a bit of a reach, or man, what a steal. And I kind of thought, well, there's probably some conventional wisdom there that they're pulling from that it might be correct. But how do we actually know whether a player is selected above or below expectation? Because that's how we define like a reach or how we define a steal. And so I thought, mock drafts would be a good place to start to look at how we can find kind of the signal and the noise of what's going on in the draft process, because the draft process, as you go through it all, there's really, a good number of important kind of points in the process where we really think that information in the public market is changing because the draft is a marketplace. And so, how do we know what someone's draft stock is? How does that change over time? What affects it? And so to me, I mean, as a student of economics, I was interested in this kind of theory of the crowd. How smart is the
Mm-hmm.
crowd? We have a lot of research that goes and looks in social science about the kind of the power of the crowd. And so for the most part, a lot of research has confirmed that on average, the aggregation of many forecasts is usually more accurate than a single forecast alone. So, I went from, hey, I'm going to pay attention to one person's mock draft who might have just a big platform to, hey, let's actually analyze this as data, and let's look at it in a kind of a critical way, to kind of look at something that I think a lot of people view as sort of very opinionated, and very subjective, and let's make it a little bit more objective with data.
Yeah, I mean, something that I always speak to on this podcast is wisdom of the crowds. And coming from a fantasy perspective, fantasypros.com is a website that, much like your website, aggregates the fantasy rankings of all the experts, whether it's, pre-draft in August when you're doing your fantasy drafts to see when you should draft them, or in season who you should start on your team. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Basically just aggregates, gets an average of their rankings, which is a little different than what you're doing. But I always speak to wisdom of the crowds here on the Ride and NFL DFS podcast. In fact, I believe I have referenced before James Surowiecki's book, Wisdom of the Crowds. And it's a book that I've read, and I really do believe that, the aggregation of information is much more accurate than any one person's over time. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the predictive nature of expected draft position, and if you could just speak to what that is, because when people load up grindingthemocks.com, they're going to see that expected draft position acronym, and if you could just speak to the predictive power first by position, like is there a certain, I'm guessing that, and this is the only thing I'm going to say before I hand it over to you, I'm guessing that QB is probably not very predictive, or maybe a little bit all over the place, just because a lot of teams move around and come up for quarterback and things like that. But if you could just speak to the predictive nature of the EDP on grinding the mocks.
Yeah, so EDP, because a lot of times you hear in sports analytics people call, for example, in hockey and soccer, expected goals, they call it XG. And so I was like, oh, well, should I call it XDP? That didn't sound very good. And I was like, oh, well, like it's kind of like average draft position, but it's a little bit more. It's not quite just a simple average. There's a little bit more that goes into it. So I call it expected draft position and a shorthand for EDP. And so what's the predictive power of EDP? It's a good question. So this is the second full draft season that I've been doing this for. So I started kind of doing a proof of concept of this stuff in the 2018 NFL draft. But I really kind of, once I saw some of the interesting kind of insights in the charts that I could make, I decided to kind of go kind of full in the 2019 draft. And so there's really not a whole lot of predictive power that I can say with a lot of certainty. But when I look at actual draft position and I look at what I have in expected draft position, when we look at the variance in an actual draft position, expected draft position explains about 80% of the variation in actual draft position, which is pretty good. And so I'm always trying to do better. But that's kind of the very basic measures of what I call expected draft position explain 80% of actual draft position. But you're right to question, because on the top level, it might look that it explains a lot, but then we can see a lot of variance in the kinds of slices of data that lie underneath. So you asked about position. So quarterbacks, like you mentioned, tend to be overvalued quite a bit in mock draft data. So over the last 2 years that I have data on, the median kind of difference between the actual draft position and expected draft position for quarterbacks is the highest, really, when we adjust for the value of picks. So when we say that picks in the first round are more valuable than picks in the second round, for example. So when we look at that, quarterbacks tend to be the most overvalued. And so a part of it, I think, is that, in the mock draft marketplace, people have certain ideas and about what's going on with certain quarterbacks. They might react to certain information differently than others. Quarterback is a very valuable position. They might think that some teams want to take quarterbacks and kind of push them up in value artificially. I kind of haven't really come up with a good theory of action for why quarterbacks are valued so highly, much more in mock drafts than they are in actual drafts, other than the fact that I think people kind of just want to push quarterbacks on teams, or they think this quarterback belongs in a certain space in the draft. So, in the 2018 draft, that was a kind of bumper crop of quarterbacks because we had Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, and that was a lot. We had 5 in the first round, including Josh Rosen, who I always seem to forget, mostly because he hasn't really played.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how could you?
Yeah, my fellow Jew, the chosen Rosen. So there were 5, and so I think people kind of forgot that that's really a lot of quarterbacks. This year I only expect about 4 quarterbacks to go in the first round, and that's kind of more of the norm. 5 is a lot. And so, in that year as well, you had kind of a lot of love for Mason Rudolph, even in the first round. He ended up going in the third round. And so at the same time, I don't want to overstate it, but for the most part, the same trend that happened in 2018 happened in 2019. And the poster boy for that was Drew Lock. So, in the future, when I want to kind of do some kind of better adjustments of expected draft position that actually account for kind of the market share of the different rounds. So, if we have expected draft position, we shouldn't be a slave to a metric, right? We should kind of view it in its context. So, just because we have 5 quarterbacks in the first round, we're saying theoretically, like last year, we had Haskins, we had Kyler Murray, we had Daniel Jones, but were we forcing Drew Lock? And it turns out that in this case, we kind of were. So there's definitely adjustments that I want to make in the future to account for the overvaluation of quarterbacks, but the position that I do best at is one of the positions that matters one of the most in fantasy football, not as much on the real field play, which is running back. I tend to do pretty well with running back of getting those right on average, but in the small sample of the past couple years. So I feel good about that. Quarterback tends to be really overvalued in mock draft marketplace. I haven't done as much investigation into how that looks just because the sample is so small. In the future, my plan is to do a little bit more engagement and research into kind of what drives some of those things.
Yeah, it's actually, a once a year event is unless you've been at it forever, is a tough sample size to hash out. The one thing that as I hear you speak, is something that I feel like is becoming more prominent to me, is that these mock drafts that you're aggregating seem to mirror fantasy football drafts a little bit, in the fact that some of the positions that are overvalued, such as the quarterback. But then I want to talk about the rounds, right? There's 7 rounds in an NFL draft. And I feel like in a fantasy draft, you can kind of pinpoint who's going to be taken in the first, second, third round. And then the wheels kind of start to come off the wagon. Fantasy players start to reach on their favorite, maybe a player from their favorite team, or somebody, a quote unquote sleeper that they don't want to get sniped on, and the variance just starts to really come into play as you get later in the draft. Is that something that you see in the mock draft data? Is it easier to predict the first few rounds, or is it not that way?
Yeah, you're right on. The first round and the third round tend to be the more predictable rounds, and I think that's because there's a good amount of players in the second round who I projected in the second round that end up in the first round, and a little bit vice versa for the second and the third round. So, the second round and the first round and the third round, the first 2 days of the NFL draft, those tend to be the days that I do pretty well. After that, in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, it's kind of all over the place. But I tend to do the 7th round pretty well because, for the most part, guys that are there for a reason. And a lot of players that I kind of have in the 7th round, or a lot of them, potentially go undrafted. There's not a huge difference between 7th round and undrafted. But yeah, so I think a lot of the times the second round, there's a lot of value to be had in the second round of the actual draft, because, the first round is only 32 picks. So we talked about small sample size before. The 32 picks of the first round, the way I have it, out this year is 4 quarterbacks, 5 cornerbacks, 5 edge players, 3 linebackers, if you include Isaiah Simmons in that, who are off-ball varieties, 6 offensive tackles, 2 defensive tackles, 5 wide receivers, 1 center, 1 safety. And so if we have like even a little bit of a swing, and like let's say that we add another wide receiver in there and we have 6, well, that means that another player who you thought might be a first round player ends up in the second round. So picking in the early second round is very, very beneficial because not only will you be accessing players who are expected to be available at the beginning of the second round, but you're also going to be ending up with players that were potentially first round kind of expected talents. So, the first picks of that second round are very valuable. And so sometimes, last year, for example, the Indianapolis Colts, the last draft, the Indianapolis Colts made a trade with Washington Redskins for the Washington to move into the first round to select Montez Sweat, the defensive end from Mississippi State, and they traded a future second. Well, that future second is the 34th overall pick, which is basically a first-round pick. So Indianapolis is a very smart team. Chris Ballard is a pretty shrewd individual negotiator. So, it helps to trade with teams that you expect to not be as good and kind of feast on their poor decision-making, especially when Bruce Allen's no longer around to complain.
So, piggybacking off that, are there any specific teams that seem to be more predictable from a mock draft standpoint if you have that data? Like, I assume the Seahawks, the way they go off the rails sometimes, the predictive power of some of these aggregated mocks don't really nail down the Seahawks. But are there any teams that, or is there some type of metric that you have to say like this certain team is kind of goes with the flow, and then this certain team usually is off the rails a little bit with their pick?
No. So I wrote an article recently that was published in Football Outsiders, where kind of go through kind of expected draft position and what grinding the mocks is, and then I define, I go into some detail and I define a metric that I call draft surplus value. And basically, it's just this residual between actual and expected draft position. And so you can look at it on all those different dimensions like we discussed, like round by round, position by position, and we can look at team by team. And so, I encourage people to take a look at the chart because it's really kind of an interesting way of looking at drafting. And, one of the things I was talking, with a friend about this, and I mentioned, and you're right, there are some teams that you think of as heterodox thinkers in the draft. The Seahawks are one of them. The Falcons, the 49ers, the Patriots. There's teams like that, but there's teams on both sides of the spectrum who do very well in drafting. So on that side, there's those teams that I just mentioned who kind of tend to pick players, a bit higher than expectation. So, for example, the Seahawks drafted LJ Collier in the first round and DK Metcalf in the second round. And if you had told me it was vice versa, I would have believed you. So, but at the same time, there's teams on the other side, like the Ravens and the Cowboys and the Saints, the Bills and the Titans, who tend to draft players who kind of tend to let the board fall to them and then take really good players. So, and those teams can be successful too. So just like in fantasy football, when you're drafting your team, you might end up with a bunch of value picks, or you could end up with some picks that are maybe heterodox. And I don't think that necessarily the draft surplus value is associated with teams being good or bad. I think it's probably all over the place because, to be honest, there's a lot of things that are really fundamental about football that make those teams that I mentioned heterodox on either side good. And a lot of them is strong quarterback play. So the Seahawks have Russell Wilson. The Falcons have Matt Ryan, Jimmy G with the 49ers. I could go on. Like, if you have a really strong quarterback situation, then I think it's actually not a bad idea to go heterodox in certain situations, to value players maybe differently and try to exploit market inefficiencies. And I know that in the DFS game, that's a lot of how the best players do really well, is they kind of stick out heterodox positions that have potentially higher variance. And so teams do that as well, even though it's not always kind of apparent from just looking at the draft from from a kind of face level view. But if you take a bird's eye view like I am, it can look a little different. And so I don't think we should be judging teams for picking players above or below expectation unless it's really obvious. So, like, for example, Mike Mayock, the general manager of the Las Vegas Raiders, said this week that it's really easy to see when general managers reach for players. Well, he needs to look more closely at himself because last year the Oakland Raiders selected Clelin Ferrell, the defensive end from Clemson, at 4. And that was the largest reach in my draft data in terms of a value-based pick perspective. In my 2 years of collecting the data, and I wouldn't be surprised if it kind of stayed that way. So I think you can judge teams when you make a high pick and it kind of looks really odd. But for the most part, their teams can make those selections and still do well. I don't think the Raiders necessarily have that luxury, but the Seahawks do. The Falcons, in some sense, do. The Patriots definitely have in the past. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, I mean, you made two really good analogies there that I think the listeners can definitely relate to. I mean, in a regular redraft fantasy league, you can make a reach on a player who is supposed to go in the 12th or 13th round in the ninth round, and he can perform like a fifth round player, and vice versa. So I think that's a really good point there. And then especially the DFS point. Some of those teams that kind of let the value fall to them, or kind of take the most obvious picks when they're on the clock, I think would be more of a cash game player, a 50-50 or a double up player. They are just trying to hunt for the most value, and they're trying to maximize their point per dollar score. And then you're right, the guys that win the $1 million prizes are the ones that just go off the beaten path a little bit and embrace variance. And when it hits in their favor, they are the ones that cash in. So funny that you mentioned Mike Mayock, because I think that, and it's based on a story that I heard Daniel Jeremiah mentioning. I don't know where I heard it or read it, but it just popped up into my mind when you mentioned Mayock. And I think that this aggregation of mock draft data is something that a lot of teams should be embracing, because when they quote unquote grind the tape, let's say that's the opposite of grinding the mock, they a lot of times they're only watching 3 or 4 games, and their scouts might only watch 3 or 4 games of a player. And Daniel Jeremiah was telling a story where he and Mayock were out to eat, and they had completely different opinions on a player. And Mike Mayock said something to the effect that, well, I hope you didn't watch him in November of his senior year, because he had a hamstring that the entire month. And that just happened to be the only games that Daniel Jeremiah watched. So, he was down on a player because he was probably playing at about 50% because he only watched 4 games of tape on him. And I think, what you're doing here, aggregating all this data, especially by the more accurate experts, is a way to kind of weed out those inconsistencies in quote unquote grinding the tape. So let's move on to specific players, because really, I encourage everyone listening to go to grindthemox.com and play around with all of the tools. It is a shiny app that you get redirected to, which is pretty cool. You can see all the graphs. You could play with all of the different players and metrics that Benjamin has put into this website. But the purpose really of this podcast and all the podcasts over the next 2 weeks is going to be to try and spot some inefficiencies in betting markets with some players. And the first player I want to talk about is DeAndre Swift. And I know you mentioned that running back is one of the positions that you have been the most accurate. And what does the mock draft data kind of say about DeAndre Swift and maybe his range of outcomes for this year's draft?
Swift has kind of been the number 1 or 2 running back throughout this entire process. His main threat was Travis Etienne, for the running back from Clemson, who went back to school specifically because he said he wants to be a first-round running back. So I don't know if Swift will actually get that treatment. I have him as a kind of late first-round, early second-round player with like more of a likelihood that he ends up on the second-round side than the first-round side, just because that's kind of how my data views it. When you look at the kind of the trend that he's going as well, he's kind of flattening out a little bit. I don't know if you'll see like a late surge to him over the next week, but I'll obviously continue to track that. So, as of taping, I believe that he's kind of a borderline first round, but I would be more likely to guess that he would be early second round for him.
Yeah, so right now his his prop is exactly 32.5. So they're daring you to bet one round or the other. I think that's a prop that I would probably sway to wherever The juice takes me. I didn't write it down, but I think he is more likely to be, according to the books, taken in the first round. So if there's a little bit of plus EV there on the 32.5, I wouldn't mind putting a little bit on DeAndre Swift. The main bet that I want to talk to you about in this round, and since you think that since you're leaning DeAndre Swift in the second round, you're probably not going to like this. But the odds did look somewhat decent. For two running backs to go in the first round, I'm guessing that someone would have to be enamored with Jonathan Taylor's combine numbers, because it looks like he'll be the second running back off the board most likely. Is there any way that you can see the variance rearing its ugly head and both DeAndre Swift and Jonathan Taylor
I
going in the
don't
first
see it.
round?
I think the way that the draft has kind of run the past few years, like the past years I've been looking at it, for example. So, in the 2018 draft, we had kind of a run on some late round, first round running backs that I thought were early second round guys. So I think that there's potential if there were some guys, if Taylor had a higher expected draft position that was more like early second round than mid second round, because I have him going in the kind of early 40s which is in the second round, right? So I'm not sure if I see as much for his range to be. I mean, I think it could happen. I don't want to rule it out, but I think that if I had to put money down myself, which I don't do that much, but I would think that I wouldn't take that bet necessarily. But yeah, so to me, Swift,
Right.
if there were some other backs that were kind of like really close, then I'd think more about it. But Dobbins and Taylor. And then there's probably going to be, I'd take 2 in the second round, but definitely not 2 in the first.
Right. So basically the odds that they're giving you on that is plus 325, which is basically like 3.25 to 1, which if we calculate that percentage, it comes out to about, 23.5%. So basically the way I would have to look at that is, do I think it is more than 23% likely that 2 running backs will be taken in the first round? And judging by the way you're talking and the way you are analyzing those mocks, it probably isn't going to happen. Even though that is a pretty good odds, I think that's something that you probably don't even want to take a flyer on. The position that I've been enamored with this year is the offensive tackles. So real early on, I bet Tristan Wirfs to be drafted within the first 8 picks. And then I added to that with Jedrick Wills to be drafted within the first 10 picks. His line has since moved from 10.5 to 8.5. So that's a good swing in my favor. But the tackles that are going to be taken in the first round. So we have Tristan Wirfs, probably he's mostly projected to be the first tackle off the board. But I've seen Mekhi Becton up there. His senior season and off season, I feel like has been a roller coaster of ups and downs. You kind of didn't hear about him. He was a second round tackle. Now he's in a lot of people's mocks as a top 10 pick. And then Jedrick Wills out of Alabama, and also Andrew Thomas seems to be projected highly in some mocks as well. And then there's some tackles in the back end like Josh Jones and Austin Jackson. And a few others. Can you just speak to how you see or how the mocks predict the tackle?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting position to follow. Definitely, if you had told me that Andrew Thomas had the kind of offseason that he had in this run up to the draft at the end of the regular season, I would have thought he'd be the first tackle because he hasn't done anything wrong, really. I think that the discovery of Wills that happened kind of at the end of the season, people started to kind of come around to him a lot more. And then obviously as you described it, Becton had a really interesting process overall. So the way that the mock drafts kind of see the tackle position shaking out is Thomas, Wirfs, Wills, Becton. So it's been interesting to follow, and I think they should all be gone in the first 15 picks. And I think that there's some people who believe that there'll be a run on the tackle position. And so Josh Jones is the next guy up. After that, you have Austin Jackson from USC and Ezra Cleveland from Boise State. And those are the kind of 6 guys that I look at in terms of the the early second round, late first, like I was mentioning, they might have the range that could put them somewhere in the later first round that the running backs position doesn't really have. They don't have that juice, like you were saying. So
So no, I find it funny that you say that. So you would, if you had to guess, you would say that Andrew Thomas is going to be
So
the
I
first
thought he
tackle
would be
off the
early
board. Is that
on,
right?
but he comes in as the fourth
Oh,
tackle.
okay.
I think, to be honest, just on fundamentals, he kind of had a kind of offseason that was similar to Jonah Williams from Alabama, who was drafted number 11 by the Bengals last year, in that he came into the offseason really hot, and he really didn't do anything wrong. He did everything that he was
Mm-hmm.
supposed to do. I think that Thomas maybe had a better combine and fundamentally is a better athlete potentially at the tackle position than Jonah Williams. The only difference between this year and last year is that the tackles around him are a lot stronger. So I think at the top end, this tackle class is viewed as pretty elite. And in terms of depth, it doesn't really have as much depth as some of the tackle classes that have come previously.
Yeah. So for the listeners, if you have WRFs under 8.5, as we've mentioned on previous podcasts, and Wills under 10.5, I think we're still in a pretty good spot. I think the Giants have a good chance to pull the trigger on a tackle at 4. And then obviously 5 and 6 is out of the question. The Dolphins and the Chargers probably going quarterback there. We'll talk about that in a minute. But then I think the Panthers, Cardinals, and Jaguars all have decent needs there. So I think I could see. And then if the Browns, I hear a lot about the Browns wanting to trade out of 10, but they could potentially go after a tackle as well. So there's four landing spots there for the 2 that we have. So hopefully we're in a good spot there. And the lines are pretty much staying pat if you want to go out and bet those tackles. WRFs and Wills are the 2 that I'm on right now at their current lines. So now the wide receivers, and this is one I'm not too hyped on actually pinpointing exactly where players will land. However, when I stumbled upon Henry Ruggs' draft portfolio last night on Grinding the Mocks, I saw that overwhelmingly, like far and away, the biggest discrepancy in a line and where mock drafters are betting on a player landing. Henry Ruggs to Denver, and then at William Hill, he is currently 6-1, meaning if you bet $100, you win 600. That is his line to land in Denver. So have your mock drafters or has the data from Grinding the Mocks been at all predictive in exact
So when I talk
landing
about draft
spots?
surplus value, that's what I'm talking about. Though I agree with you, I'm also more interested in kind of, well, that's just me personally because I'm not betting, but but I'm more interested as well in kind of the
Right.
range of expected outcomes. And when I talk about kind of an analytical approach to the draft, that's a lot of what I think about because we often view the draft as a zero-sum game because we only get to see the draft once. Like you talked about it, it's a once-a-year thing. But in reality, the draft could go any number of ways. So Henry Ruggs is really interesting. I haven't looked as closely at his chart, but I think that the big thing for him in terms of what I think has maybe pushed him up a little bit from the 15 to more around 13 is who's selecting at 13 now, which is San Francisco, the 49ers. And so the top 3 receivers, Judy, Ruggs, and Lamb, are just so close together. You were talking about being excited to see how the offensive tackle shake out. I'm actually way more excited to see how the wide receivers shake out because, to be honest, it's so close. Like I think basically, Jerry Judy from Alabama and CeeDee Lamb from Oklahoma are pretty much tied right now in my data. So the 11-12 spot and then the 13 spot, I wouldn't be surprised to see those 3 guys just go boom, 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 which I think would be really fun. More wide receivers, the better. I'm really excited for the offensive explosion in football to kind of come from college to the pros. So that's me being kind of excited about that. But those 3 guys, I'm very intrigued to see how that shakes out.
Yeah, I think the only way that Ruggs makes it to Denver is if they come up or if the Niners opt to go cornerbacks. I feel like that's a need for them as well. But leading right into your excitement for the wide receiver position, it is a massively deep class this year. And one of the prop bets that I found interesting was the amount of wide receivers to be taken in the first round, and it's right at your number 5.5. You said that you had
Mm-hmm.
5 wide receivers expected to go in the first round, give or take. And that's the give or take is the big question there. So right now they're giving you plus 185 on taking the under. Because I think, like you said, with quarterbacks being overvalued, I feel like a lot of times they want people when they're betting want to bet that more wide receivers will be taken, exciting position, their favorite players. So sometimes that drives the betting line a little bit. And obviously, the 3 that you mentioned, Judy, Ruggs, and Lamb, will be off the board in the first round. But then we have guys like Denzel Mims, Justin Jefferson, Brandon Ayuk, T. Higgins, Laviska Shenault, Jalen Reagor. Later on down the line, a guy that I love, Chase Claypool, probably end up playing like an Evan Ingram tight end slot type role. So what does the data say about what does the grounding the mock data say about the expected number of wide receivers
Yeah, the
to
the
come off
books
the
are playing
board
mind
in
games
round
with
one?
people. I don't know what they're really they're very smart for a reason. So yeah, so my expected, if you just look at expected draft position by rank, I have 5. But like I said, we shouldn't be a slave to the number. We should kind of put it in context. And so, to me, when I look at guys that are solid, in addition to the 3 you're talking about, I think Denzel Mims is a solid first rounder, and I think Justin Jefferson is a solid first
Mm-hmm.
rounder. I do have some pause about Justin Jefferson. There's always a player that I think is a first round lock who drops out. Sometimes it's for medical reasons, like Jawan Taylor last year, and that's how Titus Howard ended up
Oh
being the
yeah,
first
from
round pick.
Florida.
So there's always some surprise guys that I think are pretty solid in their stock. The thing about Jefferson that separates him from Lamb and separates him from Judy and Ruggs is that he's primarily, and by I mean primarily, I think he had like some upward of 95% of his snaps in the slot. And so to me, it's unclear. When you look at the
Right.
NFL free agent marketplace, it's not very kind to slot receivers. It's only kind to slot receivers who can also play outside, and that's what Ruggs proved he could do at Alabama. It's what he's going to be
Mm-hmm.
expected to do in the pros. But yeah, so if I don't think Jefferson is a first round pick, I do think Brandon Ayuk is. So if it's going to be 6, I think it would
Okay.
be including Ayuk and Jefferson, and the guys that I think are kind of falling that are of those that you mentioned. Higgins and Chenault are on the way down, so I think that their likelihood, Higgins is more of a early second. I also think that Ayuk is, but I think his range is definitely in the first. But yeah, Higgins and Chenault and Jalen Reagor from Texas Christian, I project them all to be in the second round.
So the reason that this line jumped out at me is because of the plus money that they're giving you. A lot of times you will take a bet that you are not always 100% sold on, because of the odds that you're being given. And I think it's probably 50-50 at this point, that it'll either be over or under 5.5 wide receivers. I don't think that it's crazy to say that it'll only be 5, and if Ayuk or Jalen Reagor sneak into the first round there and make it 6, I won't be incredibly surprised at that either. But the fact that you're almost getting 2-1 on your money, my lean would be to go under there, and then hope that teams see how deep the wide receiver class is, and that potentially pushes teams to maybe even trade back or to wait on a second round wide receiver like Chenault or Higgins later on in the draft. The next position, tight end. And basically, the reason that we really aren't touching on guys like Okuda or Simmons or K'Von Chase on Patrick Queen is because a lot of times those prop bets aren't really out there in the market too much, or there just really aren't good odds on them because defensive players aren't sexy, and that's not really who bettors know from watching college football, et cetera. So we're kind of staying with the main offensive positions because they're just kind of the ones that you always can find a line on at most books. So this one's really interesting. I mean, tight end is weaker than ever in 2020. The first line that I want to talk to you about is Cole Kmet at 44.5. I don't really have it leaning either way. For me, like I don't know where Grounding the Mock says that he's going to land. Is the range somewhere in that 44.5 range, or is it much? I would guess it has to be much higher than that. If lower really towards round 3, if anything. But where do they
The
have? Where
mocks
does the mocks
have
have
Cole
Kmet
Kmet as the
landing?
first tight end, but it's probably not going to happen, at least in the data that I have. It's probably mid to late second round. He's my 56th ranked player in terms of expected draft position. Yeah.
56th, is that what you said? Okay, so there's some pretty good value there on the over, and that's a bet that Anthony Amico kind of alluded to on last week's podcast. He really liked the over on Cole Kmet, 44.5 draft position, and I think I'm going to actually pull the trigger on that as soon as this podcast wraps up, because if Grinding the Mocks has the range, towards the 56th expected draft position, then I think Cole Kmet over 44.5 is a definite possibility there for you to get some a little bit of minus money there. I think it's at minus 110 at William Hill. So Adam Troutman out of Dayton and Al O. Is there any possible way that Cole Kmet is not the first tight end off the board? Because there is some serious money to be made if one can make a case for Troutman or coming off the board.
Yeah, I mean,
first.
The tight end position I usually feel pretty good about in terms of predicting it. They're kind of up there along with running backs in terms of positions that I usually feel pretty good about. The only problem is there's not as many of them, so it's like a small sample issue once again. But I viewed Troutman in the third and Albert O in like the later third round, almost fourth. You don't really hear a lot about them in the first round. Like people were talking about that at first, but I think that's kind of a fantasy. But yeah, I think that you're right. This class and also the interior offensive line class are pretty weak all around. But the position isn't as important enough that teams are going to invest premium picks because the athletes really aren't there like they were last year with Hawkinson and Fant. There's a pretty big distance between the Kmet and the rest of them. I think that the rest of them are more likely to go in the third and fourth round, where I project the Hunter Bryant and Harrison, or sorry, the Bryants, Harrison Bryant and Hunter Bryant in the third and fourth round. Yeah. Bryson Hopkins as well. But yeah, it's going to happen more in the third and the fourth round. That's how I see it right now. The tight ends are kind of a weird position in this class,
and that's
for sure.
Yeah, and that's the betting lines indicate that it's pretty heavily favored towards Cole Kmet coming off the board first. I just wanted to see if maybe their range of outcomes overlap there a little bit, and potentially we could make some money there. So quarterback is the last position that I want to talk about, and there are a few players. There's one player that I think I'm going to hammer after this, and I've already looked up his expected draft position, and I'm going to lead with him, despite the fact that I'm going out of order here a little bit. Jake Fromm, currently on William Hill, his over-under is the 60.5 pick, which is, the third last pick in the second round, basically. What does the mock draft data say about
chart?
Jake
So
Fromm?
I have a draft stock chart for him, and it's just continuously going downward. So in the beginning of the process,
right.
He's coming off a pretty good year, and he was viewed as a first-round quarterback in the beginning of the process, but very beginning, like at the beginning of the season. And then this season came, and I don't think he had as great of a season as he would have hoped. The Georgia offense was pretty kind of bland. It's kind of fun to imagine if the Joe Brady had ended up with the Bulldogs instead of with the Tigers, what that would have looked like. Because I think he would have benefited quite a bit. But yeah, grinding the mocks, late third, early fourth. It's like I have him between like 95 and 115. That's kind of the range I have on him, and so it's way past second round. Um, yeah.
Yeah, ton of value there on Jake Fromm, ton of value there. And I think, one of the cool things is you can highlight all the data points on your scatter plot. And the first two that I highlighted, one was from Kyle Krabs, a guy that I respect, and then another guy that I highlighted was Mike Renner, and I respect his opinion a lot as well. And both of those mock drafts, which were from very recently, and I always like to, I assume the data as we get closer to the draft is a little bit more accurate, and that goes into the weight of the EDP. Kyle Crabb and Mike Renner both have Jake Fromm in the very low 90s in their most recent mock drafts. And I mean, if you can scoop him right now at 60.5, the over there is a ton of leeway there. Even if someone comes up into the third round or pulls the trigger in the third round, you are winning that bet. How about, and I saw Mike Leone tweet this, which is why I added him in here, Jalen Hurts
Yeah,
at
so I have his
62.5.
kind of the low range of him as 77, but he's trending up a little bit right now. I think people during the season, he had a really, really strong run, and then he kind of faced some tougher opponents, and people kind of saw that, he was benefiting a lot from the Lincoln Riley scheme, but he doesn't have the same kind of deep accuracy numbers as Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray, who really could sling the ball. So, I think Hurts is kind of intriguing. I still think that he'll be in the third round potentially, but I could be swung to believe that it'll be closer to the beginning of the third round. But I don't know if I don't know if he'll be in the second round. The second round quarterback that I have kind of borderline right now is Jacob Eason from Washington, who's kind of late second, early third. And so if you want to swap Eason and Hurts, that's not out of the realm of possibility in my mind for it to happen. I could see it happening. But I would expect that he would be in the third round somewhere. Maybe people are infatuated with this kind of Taysom Hill gadget player deal. It's unclear to me that teams would necessarily value that in the second round.
And the last one I want to talk about is obviously Jordan Love out of Utah State. Hearing that a lot of guys, I personally right now have a bet that he will be drafted over 19.5, so somewhere after pick 20. And really in the first round, you have to kind of look at who needs QB, and there really isn't a ton of teams before 19 that would pull the trigger on a quarterback. So really, I think the only thing that you would have to worry about is a team trading up if they really have a high grade on Jordan Love, or potentially, something crazy like a Jake Locker, where the Chargers take Jordan Love instead of Tua or instead of Justin Herbert.
So
but where
yeah,
does the mock
Jordan
draft
Love,
data have Love
I think
landing?
is the strong favorite to be this fourth quarterback, mostly because I think that there's this huge gap between the first round quarterbacks and the rest of them. But yeah, so it's interesting. I kind of view him in sort of the tradition of these past couple of draft classes that I've been monitoring really closely, of a quarterback who doesn't have a great statistical profile but has really good tape, and so there's a lot of kind of stock pent up in his potential. So my range for Jordan Love is 17 to 25, and so I think that you're right that it's hard to see a team just drafting him straight up potentially in that space, and I think a trade for him is pretty likely. I think it's about. I would assume that that Tua will probably get selected via trade, and it wouldn't surprise me if Jordan Love was selected via trade as well. So yeah, I have him, between 17 and 25. I think that if you were just going to look at his average, like where I expect him to go, it's like basically either the Patriots or the Saints there are strong landing places for him in mock drafts. But yeah, he could go between 17 and 25. So 19 is kind of like almost right in the middle a little bit. So it's a tough bet. It's people don't really know what to think. A lot of teams are doing their research on him right now, and I think there's a lot of interest in him because it's one of those unknowns. Like, where could he go?
Yeah, and we mentioned how some teams are, as you put it, heterodox, meaning they don't go with the flow, and it'll probably be one of those teams, if any, that make a move up into the teens for him, if that is the case. Let's hope not for my sake, though. So the last thing is I want you to predict where a few players are going to land, and popular players, ones that we've already mentioned their names on this podcast. But if you had to guess, this is just an exercise in futility. Doesn't really mean much. Won't take anything away from it. But there's 5 players. First one is the someone that you just mentioned, Tua Tagovailoa.
So
Where
yeah,
do you
Tua
think he
is my
lands if you
fourth
had to
ranked
take a
player by
guess?
EDP. And so his range is between like 5 and 7. So it could be any one of those teams that kind of
Mhm.
take a chance on him if there's not a trade. But I think that the Dolphins have such a huge amount of draft capital, and it's just to me, I think that there's been so much misinformation being pumped out that they're considering Justin Herbert. I don't know if it makes that much sense to me. Um, I view Tua Tagovailoa as kind of like the Joel Embiid of this draft. Um, you talked about variance. Um, I don't often agree with Dan Orlovsky, but he said that the other day I think that if someone took Justin Herbert over Tua, they would basically be kind of choosing kind of above average quarterback play when they could have elite quarterback play. So I view him as kind of the Joel Embiid of this draft. Joel Embiid, if he was not hurt, would have been the first pick in the draft. But because of that, there was concerns, and you can get value when you take a chance like the 76ers did on a great player like Embiid. And I know I'm crossing sports, but that's how I view Tua. I think that he'll be picked before Herbert. That's kind of what the mock drafts are saying, and it's just been that way for so long. I just really, I don't know if I see it happening. If you simulated the draft 10,000 times, you'll get certain things. Like I think for the most part, the average outcome is that Tua gets selected between 5 and 7. Herbert gets selected between 7 and 10. So I'm with the crowds, and so to me, it's Tua before Herbert. I think there's a lot of noise, and ultimately, I think Miami will get Tua in their building because they have a long-term strategy and a long-term plan for success.
Uh, Draft simulations running off your mock data is the next
Yeah, maybe.
project for you to work on, I think. Uh, how about Justin Herbert? So you already touched on him going in the 7 to 10 range. Do you have a specific team? Do you think that the Chargers, settle for him if Tua is gone, or if Miami moves up? Or do you think, if he doesn't go to the Chargers, we could potentially see a Brady Quinn-esque slide for Herbert? Because I really don't know who's going to want him. I mean, maybe someone comes up
Yeah,
for
I
him.
mean, I think the Chargers are
How
the
about a
logical
specific
one.
landing spot?
The Jaguars are right there at 7. And to be honest, they really lack a quarterback that's a franchise quarterback. And so I'm an advocate of taking a chance on Justin Herbert. He's not a bad quarterback by any means. I think he compares favorably with quarterbacks who can help teams win when you build around them. And so, I think a lot of people think the Jaguars are going to go defense or double down on defense. And with a couple of picks, I think their prime team, that could be really interesting to see them take a quarterback.
Right.
But if I had to pick a team for Herbert, I think the Chargers seem like the team. They have some players. They've picked high. They've had the Bosa kid, but they also have Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, Hunter Henry, Austin Eckler. They've made trades to bolster the offensive line, and so to me, it just seems like the Chargers and Dolphins seems like prime spots for Tua and Herbert. But I think the Jaguars makes some sense, but that's just me personally. That's not really the data saying anything.
Yeah, I mean, really, if you're a betting man, those are the ones that the odds are favoring at this point. So the last 3 that I want to talk about are Judy, Ruggs, and Lamb. We kind of touched on Mims, Jefferson, Ayuk, Higgins, that tier. When are they going to go? But how about the 3 studs of the class?
I'm
Where do
super
you
excited to
see
see what
Judy,
happens with
Ruggs,
them.
and
I said it
Lamb
before, but
landing?
Judy to the Jets, Lamb to the Raiders, Ruggs to the 49ers or the Broncos seems like the way to go here. But yeah, I mean, it's unclear, but I think that those 3 guys, it's going to be. I'm really interested. It would be so much fun. My data would be a little bit wrong. It'd be so much fun to see one of those receivers go in like the top 10 somewhere. via trade or something else, I think it would, obviously that makes it fun and shakes up the draft, and that's what makes the draft fun for me. But yeah, right now, Judy and Lamb are tied. It's just so close. But yeah, Ruggs, they're all kind of in that same mix. I said before, they could go back to back to back, and I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, Ben, this was one of my favorite podcasts that I have ever done, just because I am data driven, like yourself. I love to see how all the numbers shake out and how that fits into, how you analyze where players are going to go, their expected draft position, and just to contextualize all of that into kind of helping our listeners bet some NFL draft props and scratch that gambling itch. Thank you so much for joining the Ride In NFL DFS podcast. It was my pleasure. You can follow Ben at BENJ_Robinson on Twitter. And you can absolutely visit his website, grindingthemocks.com, and play around with all the tools there to make your own predictions.